One topic, two opinions.
We have to get mainstream society on our side. The only people we are reaching are the ones gluing themselves to the ground.
I have to disagree with you there.
The Moodring changes color. To red when our guests agree. Blue when they don't.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm an activist with The Last Generation. I believe that when it comes to climate activism, we have to do whatever is most effective within the bounds of non-violent protest. And we need to keep protesting until governments finally take action.
Hi, I'm Cedric and I'm 19 years old. I'm a student and I also work for the CDU. Climate protests should always have a sense of proportion because we need to maintain a broad consensus in society.
Will they come closer? Or will the mood get chillier? Initiatives like gluing oneself to the streets distract from the real climate goals.
No.
Yes.
Every protest is directly linked to the climate crisis. For example, we delivered speed limit signs to Transport Minister Volker Wissing because he once said that the reason he was unable to introduce a speed limit was because there weren't enough signs. We also blocked Berlin Airport because we need to reduce emissions and air traffic is a major source.
Yes, but how much does it really help when, for example, you just glue yourself to the runway and block it?
We weren't on the runway.
Where were you?
Just at the airport, which also meant that...
What do you mean by airport? The bit where people go in, where people sit and wait?
No, we were just beyond that area, just not on the runway.
And what happened there?
In this case, the airport had to be closed. That meant that the air traffic was suspended.
Basically, it's the same as if you had glued yourself to the runway.
With the difference that a plane could still have landed in the event of an emergency.
Okay, first of all, I think that's commendable. I can honestly admit. But I seriously doubt that it actually contributed anything to climate protection when you had all those angry passengers on the plane. I was part of Fridays for Future in 2019. I demonstrated with them, I was an organizer, and I also protested at an airport, but in a different way. We went there with people from the local Fridays for Future group and sought a dialogue with the managing director and one of his employees. We took a look at their plans and thought about how we could make things more energy efficient.
Weiteren seiner Mitarbeit und haben uns da einmal die Pläne angeschaut und geguckt, hey, wo kann man etwas energieeffizienter gestalten?
I don't think the responsibility is on us to have a dialogue with these people. We have elected representatives for that. Nevertheless, we see our protests as an opportunity for dialogue. First of all, I think that politicians will then have to speak out much more and take a clearer stance on the climate issue. For example, why we don't have the €9 ticket or a speed limit on motorways. And of course that also brings us to the link between what you did and what I did, namely that groups like Fridays for Future then go in and say, yes, here is an opportunity to talk about the substance of the argument.
Initiatives like gluing oneself to the streets affect the wrong people.
Yes, I agree.
I would also agree. In principle, we are not targeting individuals. I also believe that it is very, very important to emphasize the fact that we do not believe that change will be brought about by changing the behavior of individual consumers, because we simply don't have time for that. We actually have very little time to change a huge amount, and that really requires political will. I used to be part of Extinction Rebellion because I always believed that if you only protest in front of Parliament, then that, unfortunately, is not enough to make people stop and say, hey, we have to confront this issue now. And that's why we do a combination of both. We organize demos that clearly address politicians so they can actually do something, but also acts of civil resistance that disrupt everyday life.
von dieser Unterbrechung, von dieser Störung des Alltags.
So, why do you anger the very people who elect these politicians? They can influence them through elections. That's probably the exact reason why you are targeting mainstream society. But why do you anger these people who could ultimately then encourage politicians to act against you? I find it all a bit paradoxical.
So ein bisschen paradox finde ich das Ganze.
I really don't think that what we do has much of an impact on the way people vote. Even if they don't like us, they are still in favor of climate protection.
But isn't that exactly what you want people to do? To vote for more climate protection?
We have a Green Party in the coalition government, and still not enough is being done. We know from history that protests have achieved a great deal. There's no denying that it can have an effect if enough people come. And more people are joining us.
But for that you need enough people.
Of course, there are tipping points. You can see it again and again in social movements, that the number of participants rises relatively slowly up to a certain point and then reaches a tipping point where people pour onto the streets.
But if we compare that to 2019 and the beginnings of Fridays for Future, the mood was completely different. And it was also on another scale, with a lot of demonstrations of 500 or more, even 1,000 people. Even in my little village, at least 100 people demonstrated. And on a good day, at Saturday demos, there were 300 people. Where do 300 people glue themselves to the street?
So you're saying that the size matters?
You talked about a tipping point and argue that more and more people support the movement, so yes, size matters.
Up to 3% or even more, but certainly in that range. But the difference is actually the decisive factor. It's the determination to stay there and not leave again after one day. That's the decisive factor, because in the end, over 1 million people took to the streets with Fridays for Future. I would have been so happy if that had been enough, if it had been enough to influence politicians to act. That didn't happen, unfortunately.
That Fridays for Future couldn't go on like that, I agree with you there. I am no longer a part of Fridays for Future. We are not in 2019 anymore. The general public is now very much aware of the issue, on that we very much agree. Everyone knows that climate change is hugely important. And now we are in a particular situation. Because of the war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 crisis, many people's priorities have probably changed. Climate protection is still hugely important, of course. But in this situation, COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine or both have taken precedence for the past few years.
Politicians aren't doing enough to stop the climate crisis.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. We can see that the government isn't making full use of all the available options. With 1.5 degrees, I have to be honest and say that I was really optimistic. 2 years ago, I was quite optimistic. And now, well, I'm no longer sure that it's going to happen. Even 2 degrees is going to be difficult.
Yes, I see it absolutely the same way you do. This 1.5 degrees thing is ultimately a kind of fairy tale that we tell ourselves that we'll somehow still be able to achieve. There's a high probability that we'll already exceed it by 2030. And so it's incredibly important for politicians to take matters into their own hands. And I think that's where we come back to in the issue of protest, because obviously the government is not doing enough, and we need to demand that that changes.
It always takes two sides, I think. It requires the social acceptance brought about by Fridays for Future in 2019. Then, eventually, something will happen on a political level. I don't see this type of social acceptance with the forms of protest undertaken by the last generation. That's why I don't know if it will be effective.
I would disagree with that. I think protest always generates friction. But how this friction looks in detail varies greatly. We know that protesting does not always go hand in hand with broad acceptance, but it can still make a big difference. If we didn't have civil resistance, we wouldn't have the women's vote today, we wouldn't have racial equality. And I think that we need people who are committed to our cause within the parties, who are willing to lend a hand, as you just said, in order to implement climate protection. But it also requires pressure from people on the street.
So what's the conclusion? Did our guests grow any closer?
Ich fühle mich ziemlich gut.
I feel pretty good. I'm always happy after a discussion like this. I completely see that we need to change policy. But I think that the most important thing is that we have a lot of people out on the streets demanding it.
Dass wir eben viele Menschen auf der Straße haben, die das fordern.
I don't think that Aimé's style of protest is the most ideal. I just don't agree with that all-or-nothing approach. In any case, I'm motivated now because it has become clear during the conversation that not enough is being done.
Meiner Meinung nach auch schon klar geworden, es reicht vieles noch nicht.
Ich würde Cedric sehr gern noch.
I would love to meet Cedric again. I had the feeling that we could have talked for another 3 or 4 hours, and there are certainly more topics to discuss.